Welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, brought to you by AEIC. In this podcast, you'll hear from the utility industry's top operations leaders on how their companies are working to modernize and improve our ever-evolving power grid. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, and welcome to the Grid Mod Pod, the podcast where we delve into the dynamic world of the grid modernization, infrastructure innovation, and really the incredible individuals that are shaping the future of our electric utility sector. So I'm your host, Dr. Elizabeth Cook, and today's episode is a truly special one. We're joined by a remarkable co-host who brings expertise in the field that's transforming really the way we think about energy in our communities. So without further ado, let me introduce our co-host, Dr. Katrina Kelly-Pitou.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cook, for that introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today on the Grid Mod Pod. So our listeners are really in for a treat as we're exploring a topic that's not only reshaping the energy landscape, but also paving the way for more sustainable net zero communities. Building electrification and holistic systems planning are really at the heart of our discussion today, and I couldn't be more excited to dive into these crucial subjects.
And I have to say, we have some past in regards to like how we've come together from the unique perspective of the grid edge and my perspective of system planning, where we both kind of sit. So your expertise in building electrification and really driving net zero communities is a unique perspective to our conversation, all things grid mod. Our mission here is really to continue to educate and really inspire. And so hopefully our listeners can kind of take some of these antidotes and take it into their daily jobs too. So.
Yeah, I think really the intersection between the two of us, between that technology, kind of the leadership, strategic side, and putting kind of the personal growth context of grid modernization, electrification, how do we turn these big nebulous subjects into really tangible actions is really where the transformation happens. And I think it's really where the two of us have been working together for almost a decade now, actually. So I think it's going to be a cool episode. I know today we're going to be talking about sharing some of our insights, the success stories, and even kind of the tips that we've had on some of the big challenges. But I think we're both super excited. And the thing that we have in common from a passion point is just the incredible opportunities that are really lying ahead of us in the next, few years and even months.
Yeah, I have to say, when we first started talking, the term electrification was not even something that you said a whole lot, especially decarbonization or, grid modernization in general. So can you provide our listeners with a concise key overview of what building electrification entails and really how does it fit into the broader context of net zero community planning?
Sure. So the term building electrification, some people might call it beneficial electrification or even building decarbonization. Good thing, all mean the same thing. They simply describe shifting to use electricity rather than fossil fuels for heating and cooking purposes. So the goal of such a transition is all electric buildings that at the end game are powered by kind of solar, wind, renewables, and other sources of zero carbon electricity.
Yes, and the part how that plays in the grid mod is that's all changing the way our customer uses energy.
Absolutely.
So
it's big
very
difference.
Relevant.
Big difference for you because right now, especially in the Northeast, buildings tend to be what we call heating dominant. So using a lot of their energy to supply heating for their heating and cooling systems. Traditionally, that's been a challenge, and traditionally, that majority of energy has been fulfilled by fossil fuels. Here, we're talking about a conversion to electricity, where electricity would be providing that energy for heating purposes. In the West Coast, it would be the opposite for cooling purposes that are dominant.
And then also just to tie it to the bulk grid, something else that's happening when we use electricity, the energy source that is available is changing. And
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
I'll caveat it, the world we came from, the technology and what was available and what we understood was what we chose. And really what's happening is just innovation. So new ways of creating new energy sources, which is what drives our economy. So it's a super exciting space. And so we just have to really create that inertia around thinking about how we use energy differently, and building electrification is where it's at. So. Right. And so what heat pumps means to a system planner looking at the grid holistically is increased load. So on top of looking at the fact that our transportation is electrifying, so is our buildings. And that's kind of the expertise that we're getting into. And so it's really important from a grid planning perspective to understand what will these buildings look like if they all started to convert to using electric heating and cooling in all areas. So the data, from a system planning perspective used to just be the customer communicating to us what is the load they need, therefore that we can plan the circuits, aka the wires and the transformers to feed them. But what's becoming more of a realization for us system planners in the industry is being able to do the analytics ourselves so that we can help onboard and really drive the conversation with our customers. Because as you said, early on, this seems like a very complex topic, and it is, but when it boils it down, we need to get to that. What is the load, right? Mm-hmm. What will the grid see, where we can ultimately then model that impact?
Well, and I think you said something to me, which is you sound excited, which is really cool. I'm on the building side, you're on the grid side. But I think the first question that people tend to ask or want to know from your side, talk about that data, talk about the infrastructure planning that's coming into play. Can the grids handle electrification? I guess I should say multiple grids, right? We'll break that down in a different episode. But right. Can it handle it? And when you're talking about getting that data to talk about infrastructure planning, what are you even talking about happening in the future? What does that look like?
Right. So it's my favorite topic, but I think, the more and more we talk about it, that we can plant the seeds across not only our individual grid that we're in control of or managing, but ultimately really drive the awareness of the importance that the grid planners ultimately need to have the data to build the models and then run the studies. The end game would be having data at our fingertips where we could really understand real-time impacts and then control those real-time impacts from understanding how the buildings are being used. So actually seeing a building as an asset to the grid.
Mm-hmm. So I think whenever you're talking about that kind of holistic planning, even how buildings can start to work within the broader grid system, it's actually quite novel, I think, for someone within the utility perspective to also think about a building as an asset that they're even interested in working with and integrating. So as we're kind of talking about building systems coming into this grid integration, how do you, bluntly, you're really at the forefront of thinking this, right? It's not many people in the utilities are not yeah, buildings as power plants, this is amazing, let's do it. How do you realistically see this trend affecting the overall approach to really modernizing and optimizing utility systems? Are there big challenges coming our way? Are there super benefits coming our way to think about buildings as part of the grid in this new symbiotic relationship? How do we feel about it?
When we think about where the grid has come from, it was that one-way power flow. We had the bulk centralized generation from our transmission down to the distribution. So how we can unlock the power of these buildings, not only are they changing from a static load of a very predictable manner. So wake up, go to work, come home, make dinner, go to bed, where the grid planners really could dispatch generation in very large chunks and serve the end. What we're transitioning to, especially when the buildings start not only onboarding this increased load, there's also technologies, as we've talked about in our previous podcast, All Things DER, is you now have generation, which can counteract that increased load. So how we can get there is installing the right sensoring and measuring devices that can bring back the data. And then we start managing the grid from, I like to say, pockets. So breaking the grid from the very robust, large one way to really decentralizing the circuits so that the data can speak to really the dispatch of not only the generation there, but of how the building's being used, which is differently. And to have that happen, we need to really create the bridge between the customer who's using the energy and us who serve the energy across all the different wires that exist today. And so I think there's a transformation happening because we all just think of our utility when we're moving or when our lights go out. A new perspective is looking at how we use energy and really trying to change our human behavior for our benefit. And I think that's like another dialogue that we need to like continue to talk about in this industry is we're not trying to change behavior for a detriment. We're trying to change behavior to benefit not only the user of the energy, but to the community that the energy is being used like holistically. And so if we could just like pivot that conversation, I think that we as the customers who want to use the energy will start thinking of it differently. And so that really comes into how's the building, how are they built, what types of systems, not only your heat pumps, but like what counteracting systems could be enabled through not only retrofits, but new builds, really the whole gamut, right? It becomes a very complex roadmap because I'll say, I don't know how my furnace works. I'm not sure how a heat pump works. So, like I'll flip it back to you. Like, what do you think and what have you seen as powerful engagements with your customers and really designing these buildings, and how do they take those baby steps to really show up differently?
I think that, what coming from an A&E perspective, when we talk about building electrification, the number one thing to keep in mind is it's not just a switch from how you're consuming energy, if you will, the type of it, but it's also how you're being very conscious about really increasing energy efficiency. So whenever you're talking about, creating the electrification of buildings, you're designing a building that inherently your first goal is to really cut down that energy use as much as possible. This is something that's, kind of straightforward, I think, on a lot of European design. And it was kind of for us in the 70s, it's kind of come back again, but passive design is really big. We're really orienting buildings to really, maximize the natural daylight that they're getting. We're really thinking intricately about even maybe using windows that are semi-operable, et cetera. Of course, this is different across different building typologies, depending on their kind of size and height. But I think the biggest thing that's a change for building designers from kind of the HVAC perspective is really close to what you're talking about from a data perspective is controls. It's a transformation of kind of where we stop thinking about where the building ends and start thinking about how it interacts with its broader kind of district elements, if you will. For us, whenever we're building designs, we oftentimes from a heating and cooling perspective are thinking about zones within the building or within the home. On a room basis, we're kind of thinking about, okay, metering on a floor and then on a building level, getting that data from the mechanical system standpoint, and then using that for the building's operation, right? This is your facilities manager. This is whoever. I think what you're talking about, though, is the opportunity to use what we'd call building to grid controls specifically, and really think about how building owners quit using that data for just themselves, but also start using it and giving it to someone like you, which to me sounds super practical and exciting, amazing. We have a two-way relationship, but as we know in the times we're in, that data is sensitive and data is dollars now, right? So I think that's the biggest transformation for us is it moves us away from just being sort of mechanical, electrical building engineers from an MEP perspective to start actually thinking about how do we operate within an infrastructure context?
I always love to ground ourselves in where we've been and then set the stage of where we are and then how we can get to where we want to be. And so if you think about the first power grid per se and the design thereof was within a building.
Yeah.
And it was only until it was like, wait a second, can we take this generator that we're putting in the basement and from an, economies of scale, make it bigger and send the wires into multiple homes. And so we've scaled up and we scaled up very large.
Yeah.
But in that whole process, when that design and that capability came to be, we didn't have computers. We didn't have the measuring and sensing equipment to really be able to understand how the current voltage, watts and VARs interact with each other on that near real time. It was just theory that was like, we were able to calculate with beautiful mathematics from a human perspective. And so over the last 100 years, though, we've, developed computers. We have the capability to communicate through Wi-Fi and fiber, and we're able to now sense and measure like the interaction of the whole building ecosystem. Mm-hmm. And then how do we parlay that to the grid system? So it really, again, and I think it's kind of exciting in the world we're stepping into is it's all about our human behavior and our like how we show up. And so like a big part of the grid mod that I want to really create in these conversations is really empowering utility professionals to show up as understanding this different perspective. So we're going to go from the world where as the building stopped asking really questions of how the energy was being created and then brought into the home, is like creating that dynamic conversation of we all have a play in this. And there could be a seamless integration. I truly believe that if we understand that the grid owners that exist today need the building owners, aka our customers, to understand how they want to use their energy in the future. Yeah. And that conversation becomes more fluid, creating this, effective realization if we need to be sustainable, right, and healthier communities, it really will come down to how we use our energy. I was just tying that in, in the context of, electrifying buildings. Do you find those conversations showing up with your customers and how they want to do this with their building? Like, what are their drivers per se?
Yeah, I think I was actually going to ask you the same question, which is, you rattled off a lot of stakeholders there actually for me. And it does sound puppy dogs and rainbows, which is great. But like, what is it really like to break that down between utility professionals, those technology experts, community stakeholders, and building designers, right? I think from my standpoint, it's challenging from the real estate perspective, actually, if you will. If you're talking to a designer all day, every day, give us a new challenge. We're here to do it. We're designers, right? Everybody wants to do design a rocket ship. Realistically, whenever people are talking about dollars per square foot and real estate investments specifically are being made by people in the financial industry who have no understanding of I bashed finance professionals and I didn't mean to. I deeply respect them, but they're just different, right, than engineers. It's different, right? It takes a lot of convincing, but it also, whenever they're working with a timeline on how they're making money and when they need to do that, when things need to get constructed, this is a process that doesn't exist. So for me, I find people are interested in it. I find the actualization of it is reluctant. I'm seeing small tiptoes kind of start to happen. But how are you feeling about that from your side? Because I know you're all over the place and talking to people every day, which is, to be honest, one of the only utilities I've ever worked with who is getting out there and being proactive in bridging that gap with real estate professionals.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about it is the power of three, right? I find there's the utility space. Our job is to ensure the safe, reliable, and affordable distribution of power. Really understanding our core and understanding the assets that are today, and then ensuring that when a customer wants us to connect them and how we continue to give that power is a large job in itself.
Yeah.
So from the technology perspective, I think us in the utility space have seen it kind of come to be, and it's available to us. And when I say technology, it's the sensoring, the measuring, the capability to bring the data, run the models, and then not only do, load forecasting and scenario planning, but take it all the way into real-time dispatching. So we've seen that been done. But the trick is kind of what you talked about, the financial models. Every utility is made up of a different set of financial models, how they're owned, how they look at their sheets, as well as the regulatory model. So when we talk about stakeholders, we have the federal regulation over our transmission grid, and then we have our state regulation over our distribution grid. And then we have our customers who we need to educate and really communicate differently than we have in the past, because it's just a mindset shift. So you're right. I think it's in our best interest as an industry to have those conversations and make sure that the perspectives of each and the desires that are coming to the table are open and transparent, right? Yeah. From a, understanding of where we're headed. And I think what's happening really since 2021 is with all of the federal funding through the IIJA and then the IRA and then even the CHIP bill is focused on enabling us to change the way we think about energy. And I think we don't talk about it enough in really the nuts and bolts. And so the idea behind that is to give us the inertia to say, okay, from your, as you just said, you can design a building all day long and make a beautiful passive building that uses no energy, but there's a cost to it. So if we as a society could figure out how to drive the costs down somewhat to then show the benefits, then we have that whole, as you know, Miss Economist over there, drives the cost of all of these devices that we need to interact together, which then enables our business models to start penciling out. And as we talk, and I'm talking here, that is very complicated. So I think the only way we can break through is baselining the performance of our existing grid, as well as baselining the performance of buildings, and then start doing the scenarios and penciling out, and solutioning. And I think a lot of times we as humans want to go straight to the end, right? Like, how much is it going to cost me and what is the benefit, right? Before we do any of the feasibility and the base analyses, and then start, building the project out. So just, I think what we do in your work and my work is like really empowering in that perspective, because giving the roadmap, that's kind of the goal, right?
I think even having that goal, like you said, I think when you're talking about all of the financial incentives that are in place there, that to me has been the biggest change that we've seen. If you're working within building construction, it makes the most sense right now to build the most sustainable building possible. Whenever you're penciling down the tax incentives that are coming up, the bonus depreciation, how much they've extended the solar bill, everything you mentioned, as long as you have someone who understands how to almost financially engineer your system, as well as just engineer your system from an MEP standpoint, we can electrify those buildings. I think the goal that you mentioned is actually super important, because we actually do need to have an end goal. We've seen countries around the world, right, that just went all over the place with rooftop solar. And now actually the grid is suffering from it at certain times of the year, right? Too much wind, same thing. So I think what's an opportunity that we have, although we were arguably a bit behind in the electrification of buildings and renewable systems integration, specifically in the Northeast, I think we have a moment to kind of learn from those systems too, and really think, to your point, what is the ideal price point actually that we need to have from a utility perspective? What's the ideal amount of that localized generation we want to have? Because to your point too, there's a degree of resilience that we're building in as well too. Whenever we think of the war of the currents, there was that economies of scale savings, but now we also have the climate impacts that are making that kind of energy burden the opposite, right? So it's interesting to think about as we're talking about the localization of these energy generation assets too. There's a transformation that's ready to happen there too, that can also unlock a lot of social change as well. And so I think if we can just keep thinking about financially, who needs to have the change impact them the most from a health perspective as well, where does it need to happen? That's where the symbiosis, I think, between utility planners and really building planners can really unlock and really help to architect some really cool societal solutions right now.
About, I think, all of grid mod topics, we could talk for hours. And I hope, hopefully the idea of the listeners is, when we think about everything that's going on, the grid as a whole is 4 large components: generation, transmission, distribution, and then the edge, the customer, the buildings. And those 4 now have to synergistically understand each other, but also being played together. Where I think, why I know how we've planned and really protected was really siloed. So we have a great opportunity. And I think if we start doing the planning from the edge bottoms up, will give us all new insights to really drive change and create new ways to enable the electrification that's occurring all around us. So thank you, Katrina, for this enlightening episode of the Grid Mod Pod. You're an incredible guest. And I think that perspective and expertise that you have on building electrification, net zero planning is a very large topic that, you and your team have effectively, been driving. So, and helping really the electric utility sector, because that conversation is very important.
We're trying. I don't know if we're doing it, but we're trying. So everyone has a role in it, right? So it's been a pleasure to collaborate, but I'm excited to keep sharing more stories too, and learning from other experts in this area who've been able to push the change. So I guess it's going to be great to just continue to stay tuned for those exciting conversations and case studies on grid modernization, innovation, leadership strategies, and growth, because those personal case stories, that's what we need to keep sharing. How to do it, right? We know the problem, how do we solve it?
That's a wrap for this week's episode of the Grid Mod Pod. Thanks for tuning in. We hope today's conversation got you thinking about new and creative ways to improve our power grid. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel to be the first to hear new episodes. This podcast is brought to you by AEIC, the place where operations leaders come together to share knowledge and provide guidance to the electric utility industry. We'll be back with a new episode soon. Until then, keep powering on.